Welcome to JVR's first Open Dialogues Frequently Asked Questions session. Now, at JVR, we often get asked quite tough but very important assessment-related questions. And we typically debate and discuss these questions internally, but we thought of opening up these dialogues to others who could potentially also benefit from our discussions internally. Now, one such question that we sometimes do get asked is why, even though I make use of a valid and a reliable assessment in a proper assessment process at Battery, I still managed to not select the right individual into a specific job. Now, today we are joined by Jana van Heerden, who is a senior consultant with JVRC with many years of corporate experience, and Andrew Morris, who is a skill facilitator, consultant, but a true researcher at heart, to try and assist in answering this specific question that we get posed. Welcome, you two.
Thanks, Yanni.
Andrew, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. Why would you say does this sometimes happen?
So if I understand correctly, Yanni, you're kind of saying that if the person had a great profile but they're not performing well, I think I'll start there. There's a number of issues. Job performance is particularly complex. The interaction factors beyond psychological traits are particularly complex. But there's four areas that I would focus on, namely the measurement properties of the assessment, the fit, environmental factors, and then also skills gaps. There may be other factors, but for the most part, I'm just going to deal with those ones. I think from a measurement perspective, it's incumbent upon us as practitioners, users of psychometric assessments, to really understand the technical manual. So let's be generous and say that the test is valid, meaning that it predicts what it says it does on the label, predicts work performance. We can interrogate that further. What elements of work performance? How was it measured? And is that applicable in my context? Not just taking correlations as a sign of the test's effectiveness. Then let's also say that criteria like quality of assessments or the quantity of assessments was met. Quality being, again, that predictability, and quantity suggesting that the more complex the role, the more assessments I might need to do to get good coverage of those role requirements and achieving that incremental validity. So let's say those are all ticked off. There's a really important property in measurement that we need to understand, and that's measurement error. So every psychometric tool has some error, some measurement error, and this refers to the difference between the true score of the construct being measured and then the observed score. That's what the test is producing. So measurement error can arise from various sources, and they could be systematic or otherwise, and this includes things like the testing environment, how that might affect a candidate and how they perform, the candidate's temporary psychological state, or even the inherent limitations of the test itself. But in practice, what this means that a candidate's test score might not fully represent their true potential. This is why we must interpret the psychometric results in the context of things like reliability, which is just a measure of the consistency of the test, of the measurement over time. And such metrics they're important because they can help us calculate things like the standard error of measurement, which gives us an understanding of the confidence intervals for interpreting the results, or the potential range rather of these observed scores. So the bigger the range, the bigger the problem. But there's a whole gamut of other factors that I think are also important to consider, and that speaks to fit, environmental factors, and skills gaps. So just very briefly, the fit components of it is not as straightforward as it sounds, and it just speaks to those different levels of fit, for example, between the organization and the individual, where we might assess for values alignment. There's role fit, where we consider the cognitive ability to do the actual day-to-day tasks, that personality fit, and then also things like interest. So the question is then, to what extent was fit really considered? Often it's merely that we've considered the intellectual horsepower, that their bright side potential seems to align with the job requirements. But have we really considered things like interest? Was interest neglected? And this is something that's quite important, and it's presumptuous, even lazy of us sometimes, to think that all applicants are interested in the roles that they're applying for, especially in places like South Africa, where it might be hard to come by jobs. So fit is going to speak to things like longevity in the role, job satisfaction, those kind of elements of performance that are also important. Environmental factors, that's again quite complex, and this is where we consider the motivation of the individual to perform, the opportunity to perform, and then also the capability. Capability, like I mentioned, is often dealt with by psychometrics, notwithstanding those measurement issues that I brought up. But then how did motivation and opportunity align for that individual after hiring? And I know of many people who have promised something to secure a talented individual, and their needs didn't materialize after the fact, which can significantly impact performance. Likewise, not giving people the opportunity to perform can have deleterious effects on their performance. Then there's workplace stress. How stressful is the environment? We know that impacts stress. There's the resources available, even changes in the job role itself. And then you can consider things like, has their circumstance changed since they were assessed? For example, getting a cancer diagnosis or a spouse dying. These are all, yes, perhaps outlying kind of scenarios, but they could all impact performance and don't necessarily speak to a bad assessment result. And then finally, there's those skills gaps where psychometric selection typically deals with measures of potential, but where we don't necessarily assess the specific skills that are required for that role. So a candidate might have the right personality mix, the cognitive abilities, but lack the practical skills or the experience to really kind of succeed in that role. So fit and skills issues are, they speak to a greater concern that I won't really delve into now, but speak to that need to have a really thorough job spec, really understand the role requirements, and measure that reality and not the imagined or the hoped for role. I hope that speaks to some of your question.
It's a mouthful, and I think what I get from it, to summarize it very simply, we've got a colleague in JVR that often refers to an assessment being quite a blunt instrument. So on the one hand, it is a lot of science are invested in it to make sure that it is reliable and valid, but it's not an exact science. There's that measurement error that you're referring to, and I think it is a lot more complex than just looking at a person from one angle. So yes, you need to know that you're making use of the correct assessment. You need to understand that there's measurement error in it, but you need to take it quite holistically to try and understand where there's a potential fit issue and where does it stem. Now, Jana, to possibly, to sit in a position where I'm sure that you've been in selecting this individual, and now realizing that even though you thought that there's potential fit here, but realize that there's possibly now underperformance, what as HR or as a consultant working within this corporate or in this environment, what can you now do, or what do you suggest somebody then do to help, in this situation?
It's such a relevant question, and I think it all goes back to asking the line leader, that's not possibly the individual that comes and inform HR, my person that you are appointed or you guys supported us in appointing is not performing, is really to try and understand what is the potential root cause of this perceptual lack of performance. Because what also sometimes happen is the candidate assesses exceptionally well, absolutely inspires and motivates people even in the interview process. But there's this assumption that even if a person has all the potential and the absolute fit for the role, that they're just going to seamlessly step into the job, into the team, and into the organization and be operational within 2 to 3 months. And I mean, that's not realistic. So it's always to gauge when the performance issues or challenges started, what does it look like, what is considered a performance challenge, and to manage the realistic expectation of the line leader versus the real perceptual or experienced lack of performance. And then once you can actually understand what the potential contributing factors to the performance challenge would be, then you can look at root cause. It could really be, as Andrew said, a motivation challenge. In lots of cases, clients do relocate candidates to other parts of the country. Their family is still based in Joburg. Now they're suddenly in Cape Town. And they thought, I'm coming to this great place in Cape Town. My family is going to be happy. They might be happy. The family isn't happy, and that impacts their performance. It could really be that the adjustment from one company to another company, or even in young talent's case, starting a job for the first time and realizing that I am now actually an adult and I'm working, is contributing that motivation and experience of actually just living to my full potential. And that adjustment takes a little bit of time. Doesn't mean the person hasn't have the potential, but the adjustment to this new reality is sometimes that from an onboarding perspective that the clients don't always consider as part of a formal onboarding or landing process. And while I'm talking about that, I think sometimes a lot of effort is put into finding the talent, getting them to sign the contract, but not always the same amount of effort in making the landing as soft and as seamless as possible. So majority of companies have generic onboarding programs where clients have, or candidates get a bit of a gauge on what the company is all about, but it doesn't necessarily translate into the specific team and environment that I'm going to operate in. So I might be onboarded into JVR, but the expectation of me in the consulting business might be very different or experienced because the business is slightly different. And because that translation from company onboarding into business area or even team onboarding isn't managed as seamlessly, sometimes the even highest potential individual finds it very difficult to show their true potential because they're just struggling to do the basic stuff, not knowing where information is, being able to know who to ask, etc. And again, that's why one would ask, yes, your assessment process might be absolutely fit for purpose, the best assessment technology, a great interview process, but how do you ensure that that person is set up for success from day one? So what does your day 1 to day 90 plan look like to really make sure that that person is set up for success? And if one can gauge that, that would be the question that I would ask. If we've done all of that, why is the person still not performing in their specific role? And then very practically is really to then understand based on those requirements or those impacts, what is the potential next step? The person might be really fit for purpose, maybe for another environment in the business. They might have a generic skill set that is applicable in other areas in the business, and they might be a better fit in that space. Or worst case scenario, one has a more formal conversation around performance management and making sure that that person has put on a performance improvement plan. But I think for me, it's always around, so when did the performance challenges start? Is it a realistic expectation that within the time frame that the person joined the organization, that it's really feasible that this person is going to really, write a massive business case if they only recently joined? And then to go back and say, based on all the different building blocks, to really make sure that this person is set up for success. Did we miss anything in the process? And how do we then support the individual, either through further development, further exposure, or a performance improvement plan? But it's part of really playing the role to say to your client, what else have we maybe not considered to make sure that this person is set up for success? That's obviously within our control.
But I think what often happens, Jana, to your point, and both of you are making such valuable, contributions in terms of why it could potentially happen and what we need to keep in mind. But often then people tend to not necessarily use what they used for selection from an assessment perspective, not necessarily get the amount of value that is sitting in front of them with regards to the assessment results to assist in translating this individual into performance, meaning you're sitting on a heap of gold in terms of understanding this person's potential, possible interest, abilities, skills. You have all of that information and you don't necessarily always then make use of it to actually onboard somebody into organization, into a team for development purposes. It's as if it was used for selection and then parked and not necessarily taken through, in terms of the rest of the process.
No, absolutely a valid point. And I think that's also a missed opportunity because the intent of the assessment is actually to look at a longevity. I mean, it's about not just using it for selection, but obviously during that process, you're going to get very valuable insights for the individual itself. And again, in some cases, a business might look at it, oh, I've used it for the selection purposes, and that's where it starts and ends. But the value of actually giving the feedback with the line manager and supporting the individual to translate that assessment details into a development plan, even though the person is new, is such a valuable part of a process that I agree is sometimes overlooked because it's almost seen the assessment is used in isolation because we've now used it for selection. Why do we need to go and revisit it? And you're losing out on exceptionally value-adding information.
No, absolutely. Maybe, Andrew, to you, what are the 1, 2, 3 things that you think a practitioner or a professional should do to try and not find themselves in this position where they've made a recommendation about a candidate and it then resulting in not necessarily performing or the candidate not performing? Are there maybe 1 or 2 or 3 things that you can mention that you think would really be helpful or that's fundamental to not being in this position?
I think it would be just to reiterate what I said, Yanni. So that thorough view of the role requirements.
Yes.
I do understand that people don't often always understand what the requirements of that role. That could be a more nuanced role. That's the one aspect is understanding the role, what's needed. Again, the quality of those assessments. Not all assessments are created equal. And then to your point, the both of you mentioned that there's a wealth of data that we have from the psychometrics. It's often only used in isolation in the selection space, but for development, it's invaluable. You spent all this money, why not use it? And you can really create a bespoke pathway for them to excel quite quickly based on their psychometric results. So Jana, you mentioned their manager potentially understanding them better, how to get the best out of them, or the individual understanding their dark side or what could potentially derail them, and coaching and working on that, providing scaffolding that's going to help them perform to their optimum and be happy. And then finally, what I hadn't mentioned was an internal validation. That's first prize, right? Is really testing the assessments. Are they doing what they say they're doing and within my context? And then just testing the utility within my particular sphere of influence and replacing if needed. I mean, there's a multitude of formulas that can help us understand the utility, even between assessments, what might be a better option rather than just flipping a coin. With different assessments or added assessments, add incremental validity to that predictive power that we have. So those would be the 4 elements. I don't want to add any more, but I think that's a good start.
Absolutely. And Jana, from you, what do you think?
Sure. I think it is to really be honest that to set somebody up for success and to be able to perform to their best, it is more than just getting the person to sign on the employment contract. That's actually just the first step in the journey. So to really be clear, if we say we're using best practice, a good selection process, great assessment technology, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to absolutely at all times translate into a productive and well-performing individual. So to challenge the thinking around the full value chain, I think that's a big part of the conversation today. And it is to leverage off the assessments, make sure the line manager is aware of the strengths and development areas, even the individual. Make sure that they are fully entrenched, not just in the job, but in their team and organization. And there's ways, very practical ways and means to get that done. And then also to really be clear on the expectations. What does success look like? So when do we expect you to be fully operational, and what does that look like? And that is part of those individual conversations or one-on-one conversations with the individual within their first month. So by month 3, what do we want to see and experience? What do you want to see and experience from your side? And keeping those communication channels open at all times. Being part of an individual's interview is not enough. If that person is part of your team, there's a responsibility to make sure that they feel that they're part of the team from the get-go. And if you have a massive team as a line manager, allocate a buddy. Somebody that's experienced, that knows the ropes more than just the job, but understand how the business operates as part of that engagement and almost getting the person entrenched within the business. And that's almost a softer part of ensuring that the individual is set up for success as early as possible in their journey once they join the organization.
Ah, wonderful. And I think to summarize, so yes, it does sometimes happen. And chances are all of us, most professionals working with assessments, have been in a position where you recommended or selected somebody who showed a lot of potential into a position, and it didn't necessarily result in performance. We know the psychometric assessments are only tools that are used, and it's not the complete solution. To your point, Jana, we need to make sure that we look at the use of assessments as a more of a holistic process from start to end. But it is the start, Andrew, is from actually understanding the technical brief. So not only assessing or selecting or looking for personality because it fits with the job spec, but actually digging into the technical manual around the personality and the criterion studies that was used. Has it been used in call centers? Has it been shown to actually predict performance or highlight potential, right through to ensuring that that specific assessment and process, does it actually then work in my organization? So that utility at the end of the day, that ROI, but it is beyond, it is incorporating line, it is incorporating development initiatives, it's much more complex. There's so much that one need to consider. It doesn't mean that psychometric assessments doesn't work. It just means that we need to make sure that we don't think of it as an in and an out, or as a quick fix, or it's going to answer all your questions. It's only a tool within a bigger, larger toolbox.
And just to add, Yanni, I want to say that we need to remember, and this is Psych 101, right, is that people are more than their profile. I mentioned some of the other factors. So we need to remember that people aren't just a series of numbers on the report, and they're a little bit more complex than that.
Absolutely.